Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
Well, well, well. So we were muted and we didn't even know. Typical, right? There you go. What a great start that is. But you know what? We have got a fascinating stream tonight. And in terms of guests that we've had on, this is probably one of the biggest guests that we've had, because the work this guy's done, it's extensive. Not only that, I think people are going to find it astonishing. Now, I know there's been big interest. We did have, well, I did have for the past 2 weeks since I let people know Jerry was coming on. Lots of people have been in touch and said, let me know when he's on. I need to watch it. So I know a lot of people, they're watching with great interest. So good evening to everyone. And we are a bit late, so I do apologize. But what I'll do is I'll bring on our brother, our English brother, Sensum, who most of you do know, right? He's the backbone of YouTube. Now, Sensum basically will be kind of co-host tonight. So he'll be helping out, which will be great because, yeah, I need it. We all need it. So good evening, Sensum. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, mate, you're coming through fine. Hello, mate. Hope you're doing well. Hope everybody in the chat's doing well. I won't take up too much time because it's quite important we get our special guest on, but it is an absolute pleasure and privilege to be part of this stream. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Good man. So I will now introduce you to Jerry Marzinsky. Now, Jerry has a master's degree in counselling. He's got a BA psychology. He's worked in state hospitals and state prisons and emergency rooms for over, well, the best part of 40 years, you're talking here. I know Jerry's talked about hundreds of patients. I guess he's probably seen thousands of patients in his line of work, which is incredible. The work that he's done, I find it really fascinating because Jerry's been very great at his job, but not only that, what he's done is went into work and not just echoed what he's learned at university. He's experimented in the field, researched while in the field, and drawn up a lot of his own conclusions from his own work, which I find fascinating, and I've got a lot of respect for the guy. And he's also got a book that I want to plug. It's called, I don't want to get it wrong, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. And seemingly, I know of someone who did read it. I've not read it yet, shockingly, but it's highly recommended. So make sure, if you can, check it out. So I would like to now bring on Jerry without further ado. Good evening, Jerry.
Good morning. It's morning here.
Yeah, I'll never get used to that, to be honest. I'm saying good evening. It's is it evening now? Well, probably is, yeah, here. So good morning to you, Jerry.
It's worse than Australia. That's the next day.
Yeah.
They're a whole day ahead.
Yeah, we've got people from Australia here as well. And I always joke about that some of us are in the past and some of us are in the future, right? I guess, yeah, that probably is the case. So good evening to you, Jerry. The work that you've done, I think it personally, I find it fascinating. And I've watched, I think, all the interviews that you've done with Mark Windows and the other guests, the two ladies that were on, I'm forgetting their name, but the information they put out, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I thought we could maybe start at a point where I've got a question in regards to your work. So you finished university with all your degrees and so forth. You're working in the emergency hospitals, the prisons, with the all kinds of criminals, and in particular with people who hear voices in their head. Would that be correct?
Yes.
And what you did at one point, and you can let us know, you began to monitor what these voices were and what they were saying. Do you maybe want to take us off from there?
Well, yeah, I can take off from there. Is I remember when I got to, I started work at probably the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. It was Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia. There were over 10,000 patients there when I got there. And for somebody who was an adrenaline junkie and was interested in abnormal psychology, that was like, being in a candy store. So when I first got there, I was brainwashed by the institutions like everybody else. I believed the voices were hallucinations, that I believed there was a chemical imbalance in their brains. I mean, all the stuff that they were teaching in the universities. And then slowly things started turning to where if you were watching, they didn't make any sense in terms of what I was taught. One of the first things I saw, they were hammering the cause of schizophrenia. And they were saying, well, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. And I'm like, well, where did that come from? And what I noticed was that the psychiatrists, not all of them, not a single one of them gave any kind of lab work or any kind of test or EKG, EEG, nothing before prescribing these psychiatric drugs. So it's like, if there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, where's the baseline? How did they know what's out of balance by how much? If they're not given any kind of lab work or any other kind of tests to measure what's going on in there. So I asked one of them, and he said, oh, well, we leave that to the drug companies. They do all that kind of stuff. I said, well, but you still don't have a baseline. I mean, you have all these drugs that you can use. You don't know which ones work best with which. And what they were doing was they just start off with whatever drug they thought would work, and then they just keep doing a merry-go-round until they found one that would work the best in their opinion. So there was no baseline. I found out they never had one. This biochemical imbalance thing was made up by Eli Lilly in the 70s when they came out with Prozac because they needed some excuse for why their medicines worked, and they didn't have one. So they just made up a biochemical imbalance, and Lilly at the time, they knew it was wrong, and they went with it anyway. So they started, funding. Oh, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. And so if you look at what they did, that they started off with blaming mothers for causing schizophrenia in the kid. The mother did this, the mother did that, the mother did something. But that was, the mothers would go, well, we didn't do anything. And it was obvious that you could look and see what the mothers were doing, and they couldn't find anything. So what they did is they moved it up a notch into the biochemical imbalance thing. And then only a very small percentage of the population could investigate that. Counselors couldn't do it, psychiatrists couldn't do it, doctors couldn't do it. You needed a biochemist to investigate that. So they were safe with that excuse, because who's going to challenge it? Who out of the population is going to challenge it? The only people who could was a very small group of biochemists, and they weren't interested in schizophrenia for the most part. So it took years for them to get around to going, hey, we don't see anything here. And they completely blew apart their theory. Well, it's not a biochemical imbalance. And before that, they started with the genetics. So here they're getting the excuses, and they're moving them up to where people can't investigate. So they after the mothers, they went, well, it's something wrong with their genes. It's a genetic disorder. And then they went from a genetic disorder to it's a multiple genetic disorder. It's not just one gene, it's many. Who's going to know that? Who's going to investigate that except these geneticists? So again, a small group of geneticists looked at it and they go, we don't see anything. We don't see any genetic link to this. And so it blew away both their excuses, and now they're back to ground level one, where they either have to admit that was what they put out was a lie, or that they don't know what causes schizophrenia, and both of those are true. They put this propaganda out to I call them the psychiatric mafia, and big pharma was they're like the drug pushers for big pharma. The psychiatry is. So I noticed, well, there's no truth to that. I mean, they have no, they're not giving any lab tests. They don't have any baseline. Turns out they have no idea what the biochemical balance of the neurotransmitters in the brain should be. None. They don't even know. They just made this stuff up and pushed this propaganda on an unsuspecting population. So what they're doing is very devious. I mean, it's and then the same thing with the voices. I mean, you're coming out of graduate school. All they told us was, well, the voices are hallucinations. So what I thought was, they were like verbal garbage, or verbal salad. It was that they didn't make any sense. But the first time that I saw a patient talking to them, it sounds like they're talking to somebody on the telephone. You can only hear one side of the conversation, and it's coherent. So I was surprised to see that, because I was thinking it was like going to be like a verbal salad of some kind that just didn't make any sense. The other thing that I remember was in undergraduate school, they told us that they made us read a research paper written by a clinical psychologist. And what it said was that if two crazy guys with the same hallucinations met, like if both of them thought that they were Macron, one of them would have to give way and change to something else. And I'm thinking, like, why would that have to happen? That makes no sense. But we didn't have access to a clinical population. I didn't really have access to a clinical population until the end of my master's degree. And even then it was a prison population. It wasn't an actual clinical population. So I can tell you from in the 40 years I've been working on the front lines of mental health, I never, ever saw a researcher on the front lines. It was all coming out of the universities. The universities were taken over by the Rockefellers in 1910, where they took over the U.S. Congress, paid them off for whatever they did, and they made it a law that the only schools that could graduate doctors were those that were teaching pharmacology, or pharmacological based medicine. So nobody could graduate doctors if they weren't teaching drugs, if they weren't pushing drugs. So it was at that time that the drug industry took over medicine. So they would pay off the universities to print what they wanted to print, to put out articles that they wanted to get out, and it all went through the universities. Nobody was on the front lines that I saw doing any research whatsoever. So they controlled the universities. So they controlled what was published, and along with that was they published that the voices were hallucinations. They didn't do any research on that either. They just go, well, these people are hearing voices. We're not hearing voices. They must be hallucinations because we don't understand what they are. They don't know what they were. They didn't do any research on them at all. And so here's another one. No research. Another lie that they published just because it backed their drug thing. It's like, well, there's nothing that can be done for schizophrenia except drugs, hard drugs. And they're making billions of dollars a year selling psychiatric drugs that cure absolutely nothing. They don't get rid of the voices. They don't get rid of the condition. It's a psychiatric mafia, and it's a huge scam. So they don't cure anything. What they might do is they'll lower the voices, they'll weaken the voices, they'll calm the person down because for the most part they're major tranquilizers, but they don't cure anything, and neither do the antidepressants. I mean, it's just this big scam that they perpetuated on the entire population. And so when I got to the state hospital, nobody was curious about what the voices were saying. It was like, what are they telling them? And it was real clear that the voices were somehow affecting these people. They were making them do strange things. So if they listened to these voices, they would get themselves in a lot of trouble. They'd quit their classes. They'd get into fights. They'd get all kinds of bizarre behavior if they were listening to these voices. And I started asking the staff. I said, well, what are the voices telling them? Well, they're hallucinations. We don't know. I said, well, who knows what the hallucinations are? So they didn't know. They had no idea. So I started asking the patients myself because nobody else knew and nobody else was interested. When they felt that they knew what they were, they didn't ask any more questions. It's like, oh, well, they're just hallucinations. That's what they are. And they just accepted that. So I started asking them, and I got into trouble for it. Right away, one of them told the psychiatrist that I was asking him what the voices were. I ended up in the psychiatrist's office being run down. The psychiatrist saying, you're asking these people what their voices are and you're upsetting them. You need to stop that immediately. They're hallucinations, and what you're doing by asking questions about what they are is you're making them worse. You're reinforcing the hallucinations in the patient. You're making the patient worse. By then, I knew that that wasn't the case because I'd been doing it for a while before they found out about it. But that happened to me twice. They don't even want you looking into it. So I had to be real careful there. But some patterns started emerging, and one of the first patterns were it took probably 2 years to learn how to talk to these patients about the voices because there's no positive benefit to them about talking about these voices at all. They tell their friends about them, and their friends go, "Oh, you're possessed. We're going to get away from you. We can't deal with you." Or they frighten them off. They tell their parents about them. They end up in a psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist tells them their brain is broken, they're hallucinating, and that the only treatment for it is these toxic drugs that actually shrink their brain with long-term use. So they are toxic. They're poisonous. And it turns them into semi-zombies. They don't feel like the person they actually were. It changes their personality for the most part. And they don't like those drugs, and neither do the voices. So one of the first things I found, the more I asked these people what the voices were, patterns started emerging. And one of the first patterns was that these voices were negative. They would tell the patient, well, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're no good, you won't ever amount to anything, nobody likes you, your parents hate you, every negative thing that you could think of. And it's thoughts that most of us have had at some time or another, but they're consistently negative. There's very little, if anything, that's positive. And if they do tell them something that's positive, it's only to get their trust and come around and stab them in the back later. So the first question I had was, why are they consistently negative? If they're actually hallucinations, then why aren't they all over the place? Why aren't they random? Why aren't some positive? Why aren't some negative? Why aren't they just all over the place like hallucinations are? You know, I've worked in hospitals long enough to see what hallucinations were, and they're just all over the place. They're scattered. There's no pattern to them. So the big question then is, why aren't these things running? What is holding them from being random? Why aren't they random? Okay? So that was the first pattern I saw, and I thought that was pretty odd. You know, a few months later, I saw a second pattern. They were anti-religious. In the psychiatric rehabilitation center where I worked, they would have these ice cream socials where the preacher would sponsor an ice cream social, and he would kind of hold a religious meeting, and then they'd all dance and have ice cream and stuff. And cake and ice cream were hard to come by in the state hospital. And these guys, I noticed that the schizophrenics just stayed on the ward. They didn't want to go down there. It's, you know, they just stayed and stared at the ceiling or read war books or murder mysteries or that. And I noticed what they were reading. It was all negative stuff. And so I started asking them questions. Well, why aren't you down there with the rest of them, dancing and eating ice cream and you know, having fun? And they went, well, we don't, you know, there is no God. We prayed to God. He didn't help us. You know, we don't like preachers. The Bible doesn't make any sense. So it was consistent. You know, they were consistently negative. They were consistently anti-religious. You know, if they tried to read the Bible, the voices would come and say, that's a bunch of garbage. Why are you wasting your time reading that? I had patients start coming to me and said, when we repeat the 23rd Psalm, the voices react to that like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. So it's kind of, well, why would hallucinations be anti-religious? Why would a hallucination care what the person was doing or whether they were going to church or anything like that? So that didn't make sense. So here's these patterns starting to emerge. And they were consistent because I'd find out one from one, and then I'd start asking all the others. And there was no shortage of schizophrenics at the state hospital. And then a third pattern emerged. I noticed that every time the voices attacked these patients, that their energy level went down to nothing. I mean, there was a 1-to-1 correlation between the voices attacking them and their energy level dropping down to 0 when they didn't use that energy. You know, all they were doing was rolling around in bed all night, being beat up by the voices who were attacking them and telling them they were no good and ugly and stupid. So fast forward, at the end of my career, there were like 30 patterns that had emerged. And I'm going to quickly read you these because those of you who are working with schizophrenics, or those of you who have schizophrenics in your family, can see these patterns for yourself. They're not hidden up in genetics lab. They're not hidden in a biochemical lab. You can see these for yourself. And the bottom line is, if these voices are running patterns, they can't be hallucinations like the psychiatric mafia is insisting. Right? So what the psychiatric mafia is actually doing is they're treating a spiritual disease because the voices are not, the voices drive schizophrenia. You know, that's the cause of paranoid schizophrenia, the voices. If you can get rid of the voices by any means, all symptoms of the schizophrenic vanish. They disappear. The person returns to normal. You get rid of those voices by any means, the person returns back to normal. I'm talking about paranoid schizophrenics, and that's the biggest bunch. Okay, so I'm going to read down quickly through these patterns, and what I want you to notice is that these patterns match exactly what the deep state and the mainstream media have been feeding us throughout this COVID garbage, and up to now. Right up to this battle we're having in the United States for our survival right now with the deep state. I mean, there's a raging battle over here right now. You know, Britain has given up. They're just sitting there going, "Oh, do whatever you want with us. We haven't done that over here. We're fighting. We're fighting hard. And I think we just might win this because we're exposing them like they've never been exposed before. They're losing ground. The only thing they can really do now is stop the election somehow, because people are waking up to what they're doing. So I'm going to quickly read through these, and what I want you to do is pay attention to how big a correspondence there. Now, what these things are the patterns that schizophrenics hear. These are psychotic individuals that are either in prison or on a psych ward, and these are the patterns that they're experiencing. And you watch, there's a one-to-one correspondence between these patterns and what the mainstream media has been feeding the Western world now since this started with this COVID garbage that they planned out and perpetuated on us, this genocide. Negativity. You look at what they're saying. Constantly negative. You're going to die. Wear the masks. Stay away from your friends. They tried to block the churches. I know they did that over here. They did that in Australia. They probably did that with you guys. Don't go to church. Wear the mask. Stay away from. Don't go to crowds. Foster and create negative emotion. Constant. That's what they're constantly doing. Fostering fear. Fostering negative emotion. Okay, and that's what the voices do. They energetically drain their victims. So that's what they're doing to us. You listen to that broadcast of constantly negative stuff for a while, and you don't have any energy left. You're depressed. They get louder when ignored. So you ignore them, they get the voices get louder, and so does the mainstream media. They broadcast in their garbage 24 hours a day. They foster isolation. They want the person to be isolated. Stay in your houses. Stay away from friends. Don't go to parties. Keep 6 feet away. Don't go to church. And that's exactly what the voices do. They tell these patients, stay in your bedroom. Don't go around your family. Don't hang around with your friends. One-to-one correspondence. They demand the attention of their victims, just like the mainstream media does for us. They maneuver for increased control over the victim. So the voices are constantly pushing for more and more control over the patient. The mainstream media and the deep state are pushing for more and more control over the population. They gaslight the patient. Mainstream media is gaslight us constantly. They manipulate our perception. And the voices manipulate the perception of psychotics. Same thing. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. Mainstream media has access to our collective memory. They want to stay in the background. They don't want to be noticed. So the voices don't want anybody, they don't want the patient telling anybody about them. If they go to tell their mom, their family, or anybody else about the voices said, you're going to end up in the psych hospital, or they're going to run from you. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happens. So the deep state doesn't want anybody knowing about what they're doing behind the scenes, how they're manipulating people's perception, how they're lying and stealing elections. They're consummate liars. The voices are consummate liars. They lie about everything. You can't trust anything they say. Same thing with the mainstream media and the deep state. You can't trust anything they say. Constant lies, constant deceptions. The voices consistently steer the victim away from anything that might generate joy or peace. Same thing with the deep state. You can't go to dances. We're taking away your YouTube. We're going to restrict the movies you can watch. We're going to restrict the music you can listen to. Same stuff. They short circuit reason. And look what just happened with the COVID vaccines. They're pushing this, and these people are just like sheep, just injecting this junk into their arms. They have no idea what it is. Okay? The voices try to pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim. Okay, so that's very insidious on the part of the voices, because they appear in the head of schizophrenics or psychotics as their own thoughts. So for the most part, they sound just like the thousands of other thoughts that go through the person's head in a regular day. But the content is very different. The intent is very different. The intent is destructive. So we're all taught from the time we're born that any thought you have in your head belongs to you. That's really bad. That's a very dangerous idea. You know, your thoughts come from outside you, and these voices come from outside of you. Emanuel Swedenborg pushed that 300 years ago when he had access to heaven and hell. He would go. He was one of the top scientists of his day, some 300 years ago. And he was a chief mining engineer for the Queen of Sweden. He was an astrologer, a physicist, a mining engineer. Very accomplished. At the age of 50, he had a vision of Christ that told him, well, drop all your physical pursuits. We're going to give you access to heaven and hell. We want you to go talk to the demons there. We want you to talk to the angels. We want you to talk to residents there. Come back and write about them so the people know where their thoughts come from. Right? So Swedenborg says none of your thoughts are your own. They either come from heaven or they come from hell. But you're made to think that they belong to you. So what you are is you're the decider as to who you're going to pay attention to. You're going to be paying attention to thoughts from heaven, which come more interior on the interior, like through feelings and intuition, or you're going to pay attention to the negative thoughts coming in from the outside that you hear as voices in your own mind. Okay? So the Indians, Native Americans here say, well, you've got two wolves in you, and the one you pay attention to the most is the one that's going to be the strongest. So you pay attention to the negative voices coming in, and we all hear them. Everybody hears these voices telling them, do this, do that, and not so good things. I've talked to one preacher. I mean, this guy was the most godly guy you'd see. He was standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, had these voices come into his head, said, jump, just jump. That happens to everybody. You could be walking down the sidewalk, minding your own business, and the voice tells you, why don't you do this? I was walking with a yogi in Romania the other day, and here's these guys on these motor scooters, these electric scooters, being obnoxious. They're blowing the horns at everybody on the sidewalk. And the thought coming through my head, they're just being obnoxious. They're just pushing their way through the crowd, barging through everybody. And the thought through my mind was, I'd love to just swing my arm and knock one of them off their motor scooter. And I turned to the yogi, and the yogi said, I'd like to cut their head off. And I told him, well, those weren't our thoughts. Those thoughts were coming in from the outside. Right? Everybody gets them. And psychiatry and psychology never ask the question, where do thoughts come from? And they drive our behavior. They actually drive everything you do. And they don't even address that. Psychology and psychiatry both moved out of the province a long time ago when they found you can't pull a thought out of a person's head. Nobody's ever put one on the table and looked at it. Thoughts are energetic. Memories are energetic. Your interior world is energetic. They can't pull it out. Nobody's ever saw a thought. Nobody's ever seen your spirit. So they went, well, we can't study that stuff, but what we can do is study behavior. So psychology was supposed to be the study of spirit, but back 75, 100 years ago, well, we can't study the spirit because we can't see it, we can't feel it. It's not physical. We can't deal with it. So they went, well, we're going to study behavior. Okay. So since the voices are energetic, they speak in whatever language the person speaks in, and they're constant. They're just badgering the person all the time. So what psychiatry is doing is they're treating an energetic disorder as if it's a physical disorder with physical drugs. And it doesn't work. The schizophrenics will tell you it doesn't get rid of the voices. It doesn't cure anybody. It doesn't. So it's equivalent to if you got a strong magnet and you're sitting there looking at it, you pass your hand over it, you can't detect that magnetic field. You can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't feel it. For all practical purposes, as far as you can tell, it's not there. So you get a jar of iron filings. You put it on that magnet, and now you can see the magnetic field. You can see it's there. Well, the magnetic field for schizophrenia are these patterns. This is what these voices are. This is how they operate. Okay? And what psychiatry is doing is like getting a bottle of Thorazine and pouring it on the magnetic field and expecting the magnetic field to disappear because they put some drug on it. It doesn't work. It never worked. It's not going to work, and it never will work. And they won't even look into the spiritual means of what's driving schizophrenia. They won't even look in. They don't even ask the patient, well, what are the voices? What are they telling you? How do they operate? What do they do? No, they're hallucinations. They insist they're hallucinations. Big Pharma is getting them to teach in the universities that they're hallucinations. They haven't done one study on the voices at all. They're just, well, we're psychiatrists and we're Big Pharma and we got a lot of power and control and we say they're hallucinations and we're going to publish all these papers that say they're hallucinations and, be damned the rest of you, So the voices are not hallucinations. If they're running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. And they're running patterns. So they try to pass themselves off as the thoughts of the victim. They sound just like the thoughts of the victim, except they're negative. I mean, most of the schizophrenics, there's three. They break into three groups. I did a little study once to find out what the patients themselves thought the voices were. One group, and this is the worst off group, said they believed psychiatry, that there was something wrong with their brain, there was some biochemical imbalance, there was no way they could do anything about this on their own. They had to trust the psychiatrist. They had to go get these psychiatric drugs once a month, and they had to keep constant visits to the psychiatrist's office. So, those drugs cost somewhere around $800 a month for these drugs to help them stay sane. And the psychiatrist visit, they go in there, they spend 20 minutes of hell. Well, how's your drugs working? Well, no, they're not working. I'm still hearing the voices. So they change them to something else. So it's just this, round and round robin where they just keep changing the drugs, and they don't cure anything, nothing. And so you've got a psychiatric bill of like $1,000 a month. You go 60 miles south of where I am right now in New Mexico, and you can buy those same drugs for like $75 a month in one of the pharmacies there. You can get a prescription the first time you go over there. They'll say, well, try this out. After that, you don't need a prescription. You just go to the pharmacy, you pick them up. These are not abusable drugs. Nobody in their right mind would take those psychiatric drugs. But they want the control over them. They want the money. And they're making a profit at $75 a month, selling them in Mexico at that price. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. So, these things. Well, we can go on and on, but if you go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, there's a listing of some of the 30-some patterns that these voices are running.
Yeah. Do you know what that is? I'm just like blown away by that. Honest to God, it's like, whoa, absolutely mind-blowing. Any interview I watch you do, I always find it very fascinating. A question you covered a lot of questions that I had, which is great. But one that I had was, between the times you were working in the prison, in the hospital, in emergency rooms, did you notice any particular increase in schizophrenia or mental illness over a certain period of time, or any patterns in that sort of sense?
Yep, it soared when meth came on the scene. I don't know why that happens, but the prisoners would call meth the devil's drug. And it just opens people up to these negative entities like nothing I've ever seen. So they take this meth, which is pouring across our border right now by the ton because Biden has opened up the whole friggin' border. So not only is there massive child trafficking going on, all these kids that are coming across the border unaccompanied are disappearing. So the U.S. government right now is child trafficking at a massive rate, and the drugs are pouring across the border. The Sinaloa cartels, the drug cartels are in charge of our border. So these The U.S. government right now is being controlled by these negative entities, by these psychotic entities, is driving this country right now. We're fighting for our survival right now. Britain's already been taken over. Australia's pretty well gone. Some of our states are gone. California's gone. New York's gone. Massachusetts is gone. Totally taken over. I mean, in California right now, a criminal can go into a Walmart. They can steal $750 worth of merchandise and only get a misdemeanor. It's insane. It's insane what's happening here right now. So when meth came on, the amount of mental illness just soared. And it started off, I mean, the meth makes these people feel like supermen. You know, like they can do anything. They can, you know, they're supercharged. They stay up for days. It makes them feel good. And then they crash. So what happens is eventually they start hearing these voices telling them all these nasty things. And they think, oh, well, it's just a hallucination. It'll go away when I come down. And sure enough, it does. So that might happen a dozen times when they come off the meth, the voices disappear. And then one day they don't. And they're there forever. And they're just as psychotic as anybody on the psych ward. Right? And these demons that run these things, the voices, they're demons. I mean, you can talk to them. I've talked to them. They're nasty. There's a whole body of spirit releasers now that talk to them and walk them out of people. I've done that. But yeah, you can carry on in a coherent conversation with them. They're not fun to talk to. They're nasty. But
you said that you quoted is it Psalm 23, 23rd?
yep,
Would you be able? Do you know it off by heart? Could you tell us it, please?
It starts off with the Lord is my shepherd. Is that the one? Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. No, that's the wrong one. God is. Yeah, that's it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still water. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou provideth the table before me in the presence of my enemies, and my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, there's one line I missed that I didn't memorize that line because for some reason I had trouble with it, but that's the gist of it. They hate the 23rd, they hate the 91st song. But you look at what's going on in our mental health system right now, and we're talking the entire mental health system, you know, yours as well as in Britain, in ours. You know, in the United States right now, 47,000 Americans killed themselves last year. 47,000. You know, only 50,000 died in Vietnam. 24 vets a day kill themselves over here. The suicide rate between 1999 and 2019 here increased 33%. And now keep in mind, there's more psychiatrists, there's more psychologists, and there's more psychiatric drugs on this planet right now than there has ever been in the entire history of this planet. And look at what's going on, you know. And what's interesting is psychiatrists, the high priest of Western mental health, have a suicide rate 3 to 5 times higher than most other doctors. So that tells you something about the high priest of mental health here. 100,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenia yearly. 100,000. It's one of the top 10 medical problems on the planet. And here they are deceiving us as to the cause, deceiving us as to whether they know what caused it, deceiving us into believing that their drugs actually do something worthwhile to these things. Those drugs cure nothing. They cure absolutely nothing. They're major tranquilizers. All they do is dumb the person down and gork them out so they don't cause trouble. You know, and at the same time, global antipsychotic drug sales have soared to $14.54 billion in 2021. $14.54 billion. These guys are making that much of a profit off of drugs that don't cure anything and don't work. It's the biggest scam that's ever been perpetuated on the world population. They're estimated to be making $15.5 billion in 2022 on drugs that don't cure anything. Antidepressant market, which doesn't cure anything either, is expected to hit $15.98 billion by 2023. So here they are making billions of dollars on these toxic drugs, and the antipsychotic drugs with long-term use. I mean, there is a use for them. I'm not saying they're totally useless. I mean, there's patients that are so psychotic and so dangerous that there's nothing else you can do with them other than drug them down with these drugs. But for the general population, for most people, these drugs, well, for all people, these drugs are destroying their brain. So what they found with autopsies with people in the state hospitals is that these schizophrenics who've been taking these drugs for decades, they do autopsies on them and they found that their brains were shrunk like walnuts, and it was consistent. So they went, well, it looks like they suspected the antipsychotic drugs. Of course, when they published this, the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. Oh no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing it. The schizophrenia is shrinking their brains. Nobody knows anything about schizophrenia. May as well blame that on them too. So thank God there's some honest people in research in this planet. So the researchers started feeding these antipsychotic drugs to monkeys and mice and rats, and found out that it was rotting out their brains and their peripheral nervous systems also. So one thing I noticed is the psychiatrists, excuse me, they never tell their patients how dangerous these drugs are. These are some of the most dangerous drugs used in medicine today. And they never will tell their patients, oh, well, this is what it'll do to you with long-term use. They say, oh, it'll make you groggy. It'll, your vision might blur a little while. You might get a little bit of akathisia. You may shake a little, the shudder. It'll dumb you down. I mean, what they're doing is dumbing down people at a horrendous rate. Those drugs reduce your vibration. Your vibration has to be low for these entities to enter. They will not enter high vibration people. People who are very spiritual, they have a very hard time with. And there's no bound to these people. Like as of 2017, over 1 million children in the U.S. under the age of 6 were on psychiatric drugs. So these people have no conscience. Here's kids. They're destroying the brains of kids with these antipsychotic drugs, putting them on them for drugs that don't work. They're dumbing them down. I mean, how do you expect a kid on antipsychotic drugs to function in school? Over 622,000 kids under the age of 5 are on psychiatric drugs here in the United States. Over 80,000 are on ADHD drugs, which is amphetamine. And I've seen prisoners I've talked to who started off on ADHD drugs and then moved up to meth later. And I said, well, why'd you do that? And they said they were feeling good with the ADHD drugs. They were calm, they were able to focus, and they just moved right up the line to meth. And what was interesting is the voices will tell them, or I talked to several prisoners where the voices told them where to be and when to be there when they ran out of meth. And they showed up at the spot they were told at the time they were told, and some strangers would show up with meth. And I've heard that more than once. Over 38,000 Americans are on antidepressant drugs right now, which cure nothing either. over 85,000 people here in the U.S. are on antipsychotic drugs, which are rotting out their brains slowly, not curing anything. Over 389,558 are on anti-anxiety drugs. So the antidepressant market is expected to increase to $15.98 billion. At the same time, an Australian therapist called John Mace has come up with a therapy that treats mental problems, and it actually works, and it works very quickly. It gets rid of mental problems. It actually vanishes. They're gone. It dissolves them, and the universities are totally ignoring it. They took it to the universities in Australia. They showed them that it worked, and the university said, "Well, you give us the copyright to it, and we'll consider it." Yeah, fat chance. They don't want something like that getting out. They don't want people being cured. And if you look at what's happened in the United States, they have reduced the money for schizophrenia research to a mere dribble, and then manipulated the statistics to make it look like they were funding schizophrenia research. They don't want a cure for schizophrenia. They're making they're making billions of dollars on people being sick. They don't want them getting any better. And it's obvious. It's obvious. It's right in front of your face. You know, these drugs cure nothing. It's a giant mental health merry-go-round. I've seen it in the hospitals here. It's happening in the hospitals there. People go psychotic. They come into the hospital. They put them on these awful drugs. They stabilize them. They release them. They can't deal with the side effects. They go off these drugs. 6 months later, they come back in again. They charge them another $10,000. They put them on the drugs, turn them out loose again. 6 months later, they go off the drugs, and it's round and round and round. It's a big merry-go-round. Each time it goes, $10,000, $10,000, $10,000, but kabing, 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 a cash register. Blah, 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 blah. Matter of fact, I showed one of the private hospitals that I was working at that we have something that can interfere with these patterns, and schizophrenics were recovering. They saw it. One of the psychiatrists saw it for themselves. The supervisor saw it, and they went. By then, I'd retired because I was tired of their bull crap. And I said, I'll come back and I'll teach your chief therapist how to do this. Okay, and then I'm out of the picture again. So they said, okay, we'll do that. So I went through all the training again, went back in, and they said, well, we better go check with, what do they call it, risk management before we allow you to do this. They came back and risk management said, no, why should we take a risk on anything like that? You know, we'll just keep using the stuff that doesn't work and just keep collecting the money. We don't want anything that works. You know, John Mace came up with something that works. It treats depression. It treats manic depression. It treats most psychological problems very quickly. It's called the Mace Energy Method. He's written 2 books, Causism and Energy Over Mind. Okay, it works like nothing I've ever seen, and I've been trained in all kinds of different psychotherapies. This works. So they do have something that treats mental problems. They don't want it out. You know, they don't want people using it. You know, there's an institute in Australia that will train people how to use the Mace method. There's enough information in the books, the 2 books I gave you, that will you can put it to use. I mean, basic use for psychotherapists. For those of you who think the voices are still hallucinations, I mean, get our book. That Sherry Sweeney and I wrote this. Now, Sherry heard voices when she was a young woman. And, I ran into her. I knew her for 10 years before she admitted that she was hearing voices. So that's how much of a stigma there is to these mental diseases that these people have concocted up. That DSM, their Bible, that Directory of Mental Disorders, completely fabricated. There's not one lab test. There's not any kind of test to verify any of those diagnoses in that Bible of mental disorders. They vote them in, they vote them out. You know, every couple of years they all meet and they go, hey, well, anybody got any new mental disorders? It's nuts what they're doing. Let me see if I can get some stats on that. Yeah, here it is. Psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, complete work of fiction, according to one psychiatrist. Every single one of the more than 296. Now, there's 296 mental disorders right now. They've all been fabricated. And they made up by a group of psychiatrists, 2/3 of which are in cahoots with Big Pharma. So they just keep increasing them and increasing. But in 1952, there were 106 psychiatric disorders. In 1980, there were 256. Now in the DSM-5, there's 297, and they appear to be fabricating all of them. So what this DSM-5 is just a list of mental disorders defined by a list of behavioral symptoms that committees of psychiatrists have debated and decided which clusters of symptoms add up to the labels that they have put on them. Okay. Again, not one of these 297 mental disorders has a defining diagnostic lab characteristic. There is no lab test for any of them. Okay. There's no blood test. There's no lab test. There's no X-rays. There's nothing. So Dr. Julian Walker said there are no blood tests. There are no lab tests. There's no X-rays. These are just classes of behaviors that a group of psychiatrists have voted to be a mental disorder. And they've got a bunch that are listed. If I can find them, they list some of the most ridiculous ones. There's something like Paris disorder. It's I think it was Japanese who go to Paris and get nervous, from cultural shock. They called it the Paris disorder. A lot of these just make no sense. So this whole book is fabricated, and they charge a lot of money for it. They're teaching the DSM, and when I was in the PhD program, it was the Bible. They don't tell anybody that all those diagnoses are fabricated. They're all made up. There's nothing to verify any of them. And they push the drug stuff too. They're selling drugs under false premises. I mean, I wish I could find that list of mental disorders that are totally ridiculous.
Have you got any questions, some that you want to put across?
Yeah, well, amazingly enough, I had put down a few notes, and I think you've touched on pretty much a lot of the things I was going to say. So, but I'll go through. I'll tell you, I'll just go through them, and if there's anything that Jerry picks up on, then he can sort of stop me and interject if he wishes to. But the opening gambit I was going to start with, and you've absolutely covered this, was that. I recollect your two streams with James Delingpole, and I distinctly remember the first stream that you did with James. It was in 2021, and you've already touched on it, but one of the most fascinating things that you talked about was that anything Christian seemed to kick off a bad reaction in the patients, in so much that the voices in their heads kicked off. And like I say, you've already touched on this, but these weren't necessarily religious people. Maybe they'd been christened, but they weren't, they wouldn't recognize obscure phrases from the Bible necessarily. Like in Britain, the term is you're a hatched, matched, and dispatched Christian. In other words, you go to christenings, marriages, and deaths, and that's pretty much your involvement. And yet you could recollect a phrase that potentially only somebody who was either very religious or had training in theology would recognize. And yeah, it drove these guys nuts. I mean, just pardon the pun there. I don't mean that in the patients, up to. But the other thing was their inner voices when you sort of managed to fetch them off the meds, so they weren't in this constant state of haze, and you were having the discussion with the patients. And he was saying, and then all of a sudden, you'd just throw in like a random bit of, like I say, a phrase or something like that, and they would You know, you'd notice their mood would change, and they wouldn't know why, but it was because the voices were telling them,
Yep.
up to and including, to harm you, just to stop you from speaking. So that was one of the things that I sort of picked up on, and it was like it wasn't just this one patient that you were seeing. It was a theme. It was almost like a constant, where you just start saying something, you know, the Lord's Prayer. I mean, everybody knows the Lord's Prayer, but these guys would absolutely, you know, they would be telling the voice in the head, you're going to have to kill him, or you're going to have to hurt him, or, you know, to stop this, because they just literally couldn't cope with it. So that was the first, which, like I say, you've already touched on that, but one of the things that was interesting to me, because obviously you entered this field quite early on in your career, and then obviously more experience, and you started recollecting these patterns, and amazingly enough, I did have a series of things about, you know, certain well, and once again, you've touched on it, you know, did they have any particular proclivity to sort of sensory patterns like images, sounds, music, smells, that kind of thing, and any fixations like numbers, places, people? And I think you've already mentioned that they actually did. And funnily enough, the last question that I had was, you know, amazingly enough, it said, have you had any similar experience of addicts like opioids, etc., which the meth thing, once again, you know, you've already mentioned it, or showed sign of sort of, you know, never showed any sign of schizophrenia or whatever, but the meth drug sort of elicited that similar sort of behavior, and you've already said that. But one question that I had was, in the late sort of Victorian era, there were early psychologists known as alienists, and I was just wondering, during your research, did you ever see any writings or studies by these alienists, so the late Victorian era guys, so before the big pharma era, that sort of correlated with your findings or discussions with the patients?
Well, I wrote down a few notes here. Well, first thing I want to say is not just Christianity that these things are averse to. They don't like the Muslim verses either. You know, and the Muslims are much more aware of these things and have specific prayers. They call them the jinn. So they have specific prayers to deal with them. Unlike Christianity, where what I've seen over here anyway is most Christians churches are go, well, we're just going to concentrate on God's light. We're going to concentrate on the good part of what the Bible says. And they totally ignore the fact that Jesus cast demons out of people 23 times in the Bible, and that they exist. They just blow that part off. So, you know, the biggest trick that the devil has ever pulled on people is that he doesn't exist. You know, that gives him absolute control. He can go wherever he wants, do whatever he wants, and people think he doesn't exist, and they just fall victim to him. So Sherry, my co-author, she said that every single thought that comes into your head that is against yourself or anybody else comes from the dark side. You know, if the intent is negative, it comes from the dark side. Okay. Now, another thing that the voices absolutely hated was when I would tell the patient that they're parasites, that they actually feed off of their life energy. So one thing I noticed is that after the voices attacked these patients, they didn't have any energy left. They were drained. They couldn't even get up to come to the meetings. They couldn't make it to the office. And I saw there was a one-to-one correspondence between the voices attacking them and their energy level disappearing. So there was one day I was assigned to the jail for the prison. Okay, and this is where the worst of the worst were housed. And in this one cell were two prisoners. One was psychotic as a bed bug. He was completely out of it, completely crazy. And here's this other guy locked in this little 8x10 cell with this guy who's pacing the back and forth all night, talking to his voices, standing over him at 3 a.m. and just staring at him. Now the cellmate, I checked on him, and what he was in that jail cell for was that he snitched off one of the drug gangs, and they lost all their drugs. They broke up the gang. They sent him all over to different prisons, and they wanted this guy dead. They'd already stabbed him a couple of times, and they wanted him dead so bad that they got some of their drug guys got in enough trouble to be thrown into the jail there to try to get at him. And they were over there and they were throwing notes under his door saying, "We're here, we're waiting for you. First chance we get, you're a dead man." So here's this poor guy who snitched him off, who's surrounded by these drug gangsters outside in these other cells waiting to get at him. He's in there for protective custody. They're throwing notes under his door saying, "You're dead as soon as we can get at you." And he's locked in this cell with a paranoid schizophrenic who's out of his mind, staring at him at 3 a.m. He wakes up and here's this guy looking down at him, babbling all this insanity. So I get this inmate letter from that guy, the guy the gangsters are trying to kill, and he says, I can't handle it in here. You got to come over and do something. And at the same time, I get another phone call from the captain of that facility saying, come on over here and do something with these two guys. This is getting out of hand. So I go over there and I pull up the guy who the gangsters want dead first, and I watch him come up the steps. And he's got plenty of energy. He bounced up the steps. He walked briskly, come and he sat down. He was anxious, but he had plenty of energy. I went, okay, fine. I'll do what I can for you. I don't have a lot of control over security, but I'll do what I can. We'll see. And then I pulled up the schizophrenic, and he just drug himself up the steps. He's pulling himself up the handrail. He just shuffling along. He sat down in the chair and he's like wiped out. No energy whatsoever. And I asked him, "Are you hearing the voices?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm hearing them all the time." So after getting done with those two guys, that was a perfect experimental situation. They were in the same cell, eating the same food, in the same environment, under all the conditions were the same. There wasn't any difference between them. It was a perfect experimental situation. And yet one of them was totally drained, and the other one wasn't. So my theory was that if I was hearing negative voices telling me all this rotten stuff 24 hours a day, that would drain me too. But you couldn't be under more stress than this guy who was locked in that cell, the sane guy. So I went, well, it's not the stress. So what is it? So, I was reading, I was wondering, well, it's got to be the voices. It's got to be the voices, that somehow they must be draining these people. And the schizophrenics would notice that, but only after I mentioned it to them. I'd say, well, do you notice that after the voices come, you're drained? And they go, well, come to think of it, yeah. But they didn't realize it on their own. It was like they were being blocked from realizing that facet on their own. And I'd go, well, okay, if the voices came 1,000 times, you've been hearing voices for years, and every time you were drained, every time the voices come, you were drained, what would be draining you? And almost all would say, well, I don't know. Well, if this happened 1,000 times and every time you were drained, what was draining you? They wouldn't even think about it. Once it was pointed out to them, they would go, oh, it must be the voices. So that's what the voices are draining these people. There's a one-to-one correspondence between being attacked by the voices and their energy levels dropping down to 0. Okay? Now, the last thing these voices want people to know is that they are energetic parasites and that they're feeding off of them. They're feeding off of the entire human race. They're feeding off of this war in Russia right now, in Ukraine. They're feeding off of all the negativity. They're feeding off of this COVID garbage. They're feeding off of all the negative news. They're feeding off of all of us. Any negative thought, they feed off of that. And the last thing they want you to know is that they are feeding off you, that these are energetic parasites. And when I was working in the emergency room, those people didn't want you working with the patients. They wanted you to get them out of the emergency room. They didn't want you treating them. They didn't want you asking them questions. So one of the things that the schizophrenics need to understand is that these entities, these voices are draining them. They're stealing their life energy. And they're stealing the life energy from all of us. You know, you listen to the news and you'll be drained by all the negative news that are coming out. We're not the top of the pecking order here on this planet. You know? And unless we wake up to realize that these things are putting thoughts in our heads to do these bad things, the wars, just like when your introduction where they had Reagan there talking, and he says, well, they're already here on the planet. Look at the wars. That's exactly what's going on. He knew it. So, you know, the schizophrenics need to know that those voices do not belong to them. They're coming in from another source. They're not their own, and that they're being fed upon. And that's something that the psychiatric mafia and psychology is never going to delve into. You know, it's not going to come from those guys. Like I told you, they're making billions of dollars selling their toxic drugs. They don't want anything to change. It's going to be coming from guys like you who are doing these podcasts and telling the population what's actually going on. That the voices are thoughts, and that we all have these thoughts, and thoughts don't come from us. They come from somewhere else. It's like your brain is like a radio, you know, that you tune it to a certain frequency. You know, if you took a radio back 200 years and you turned it on and somebody started talking in there, everybody would be going, how'd they get people in there? You know, how can people fit into that box? And sooner or later they open it up and there's no people in there. And they go, well, where are the people? You know, same thing. The voices are coming from the outside. They're coming in. Every negative thought you have about yourself or anybody else is coming from the hellish part. And Swedenborg said they come straight from hell. You know? So Swedenborg said you've got two angels watching over you, and you've got two demons assigned to you. The demons are putting negative thoughts into your head all the time. The angelic realm are working there. They put thoughts more into feeling and intuition. Okay, so it's like the feeling, well, you shouldn't be doing that, or you shouldn't be doing drugs, or you shouldn't be stealing. I mean, it's feeling and intuition, where the demonic forces are more putting these thoughts into your head. You know, yeah, that guy's a jerk. You slap him upside the head, or yeah, the Russians are bad. They stole Ukraine, and the propaganda. I mean, look at the propaganda. The Ukrainians were bombarding Donbass and the Russian population over there for decades, and Russia kept saying, "Well, something needs to be done. They're killing Russians here. They're killing Russians." You know, Russia warned well ahead of time. We're not going to tolerate NATO on our borders, and they pushed it anyway. Right now, NATO is trying to start a war any way they can. They're no longer a defensive organization. They're an offensive organization. You know, Russians has blown up bunkers 200 feet under the ground with their hypersonic missiles full of NATO people in there directing the war. You know, there's special groups of NATO and special forces operators over there right now. They're doing everything they can to start a hot war with Russia because they're being discovered. Oh, yeah, you bet. You bet. I'd say at this point, most of them are. You know, look at what happened. Look at this pandemic stuff. That's genocide.
Can I just pop in there, Jerry, before you answer that, because another question that popped up that may be on a similar path was by one of the guys in the chat called It's a Duck. Obviously, that's just a nickname. And he says, I've heard Jerry allude to a correlation between the voices and he says in quotes, germ narrative from the previous two words. It might be worth asking you about that. So I haven't heard that part, but one of the other things that was mentioned by Frank O'Brien, the guy whose quotes on the screen there was, and I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I recollect when you were speaking in one of James Dellingpole's streams, Frank asked, did you ever notice any sort of like physical change? In other words, did it all of a sudden get cold? And I do vaguely remember, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you did mention something like that on one of James's streams. Am I wrong or am I right in that respect?
Well, I did. Two that popped to mind is there was one time where the voices. I was working with this one patient who was really. I mean, he was they brought him into the emergency room. He was pretty far out there, and I was doing an assessment on him, and I got to the point where I just couldn't think. It was like no thoughts would form in my brain. It was like, what's going on here? I just couldn't think. It was like somebody opened up my head and poured a gallon of maple syrup in there. I'm like, what is going on here? I just couldn't formulate a thought. I couldn't write. And that went for as long as I was with that guy. I had to get away from him for a while to write the report. The second thing is toward the end of my prison stay, I was able to feel these things. I could feel how strong they were, and it was this unique feeling like no other. It was like this icky electrical feeling, and they couldn't fool me. I mean, I could talk to somebody in the emergency room and say, well, you're hearing voices, and they would lie to me about it. And I'd say, no, you are hearing them, and that this is how strong they are. And they would go, well, how do you know that? I said, well, I know. So yeah, I never felt the room get cold, but that icky electrical feeling was the most consistent thing I felt. So I would know how strong the voices were. I would know how angry they were with me by the intensity of that. Now, I missed, you were saying something about a correlation between something and something. I missed whatever you were saying the correlation was. The question that somebody had.
Yeah, it was the correlation between the voices and the germ narrative. In other words, the convid, as I call it, stuff from the last last couple of years, because obviously there was.
I missed it again. It's a correlation between the voices and the convict.
No, the virus, shall we say, of the last two years, whereby the sort of the psyop on people and everything that went along with that. He says, I've heard Jerry allude to the correlation between the voices and the virus narrative, if you like, from the previous 2 years. It might be worth asking about that. So
he went through that.
Yeah, look at it. Look at it. I mean, there's a perfect correlation between what they did to us and what the psychotics were hearing. I mean, there's a one-to-one correlation. These people in government right now are mad. They're insane. And unless we fight for our freedom, they're going to have us under their thumbs. And it's real disappointing that the Brits are just sitting there going, oh, well, we'll let them put us in 5-minute cities, and we'll let them they're going to take their vehicles. They're already starting. They're already imprisoning these people, and they're doing nothing. I don't understand it. Over here, we haven't broken out into a hot war yet, but if this keeps going, no doubt we're headed for a civil war. It's going to get bad. So if Trump doesn't get in, things are going to get bad. We're not going to stand for this. Something's going to blow over here. It's going to blow big time. Any other questions you guys got?
Sorry, I'm unmuted, then unmuted, and muted myself again, but now I'm okay. But yeah, I think on the America situation, it probably will boil up and erupt into all-out state collapse. I think that's on the cards, no matter what happens. To be fair, I'd agree with you, certainly on that. But yeah, just quickly, because we've went 1 hour, 20 minutes, and I don't want to keep you too long, and I understand there's a lot to take in for some people who they're maybe new to it, and they're like, "What? Wait a minute." But is there any sort of in short advice that you would give to someone who's maybe got a family member or a relative who they think might be on the verge of a possession or are possessed?
Well,
Is there any sort of advice? Sorry.
The first thing is to understand that the voices are not who they are. Unless they figure that out, they're not going to recover from this, because the voices want them to think that those thoughts are who they are. They don't want to be discovered. And I've had numerous patients asked the voices, "Who are you? What are you?" Guess what the voices said? It said, "We are you. We are you." Okay? So they take over by the person's belief that those thoughts belong to them, and that they're the ones thinking these thoughts. Now, those thoughts are being inserted into their thought stream to make them believe that that's who they are. And since we're taught from the time we're born that all your thoughts belong to you, because where else could they come from? You know, those people think that those thoughts are who they are, and that their mind has turned on them, and that their mind is now out of control, and that they got to take these drugs, these toxic drugs that psychiatry is giving them, because there is no other treatment. There are lots of other treatments that work a lot better than these drugs, and more of them are coming out all the time. You know, and the MACE energy method is one of them. There's spirit releasers who are coming on the scene now that actually will talk these voices out of the patient, because they are spirits. They are evil spirits. You know, once you get rid of the voices, all the symptoms of schizophrenia disappear. It is the voices that drive paranoid schizophrenia. It's not any genetic disorder. It's not any made-up biochemical imbalance that these demonic pharmacists have implanted with their pharmakia. It's the voices. You know, so the best people could do is get on a positive spiritual path and stay there. If you let your vibration get too low, they will invade. You know, they won't invade staunch Christians. They won't invade staunch Muslims. They won't invade people who are on a higher spiritual path and moving on. They'll go after the drug addicts and the people who, they're like sharks in the ocean that smell blood. They go after the people who are the most injured, the people who are sexually, physically, and emotionally traumatized and abused. They'll go after those guys. They'll go after the drug addicts. You know, they'll go after the people who are at a low vibrational level, and they'll move in there. Yeah, the Swedenborg, I'd recommend reading Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. Swedenborg wrote prolifically, but Heaven and Hell is one of his most favorite ones. And he talks about your thoughts not being your own. He said none of your thoughts belong to you. They're either coming in from heaven or they're coming in from hell. But you're the decider. You're the one who decides which ones you're going to attend to, which ones you're going to speak to, which ones you're going to address. And whichever one you put your attention to is the direction you're going to move.
Excellent. I find it fascinating, honest to God. And I've got family who they've been, well, one of them in particular has been in and out of different prisons and different hospitals that were meant to be looking after him, seemingly. But I mean, I can pretty much attest to everything that you've said. I've seen it, quite a lot of it, in anytime I went to visit. I was always a bit, I guess, skeptical or maybe a bit scared in a sense when I was going there. I was unsure what to expect. I wanted to visit my relative, but I was always had this image of these people running around in, I don't know, a straight jacket and trying to kill you and stuff like that.
And that's why they want you to think. You know, even the nurses. I have a nurse who could actually see these things. You know, and that's what they told her when she went in there. Well, we're going to take you on the psych ward. Don't make eye contact with any of them, or you might run into trouble. They want you to be afraid of them. You know, they don't want researchers out on the front line. You know, and one thing that Sherry Sweeney came up with that would be of great help to people who are hearing voices. If you go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, go to articles. She has a program there called That's a Lie program. Okay? So since 99% of what these voices are telling people are lies, you know, if you respond with that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, and you don't believe what they're saying, they can't get you. So if you try to ignore them, that doesn't work, because what you resist persists. They get louder if you try to ignore them. And that's what psychiatrists say. Oh, they're just hallucinations, ignore them. No, that doesn't work. You ignore them, they get louder, they get more vociferous, they get more agitated. But if you respond with that's a lie, they can't get you. It's like, okay, if you know that what they're telling you are lies, you have to believe what they're telling you in order to get in trouble. They want you to believe the lies that they're telling you. They want you in trouble. They want you to generate as much negative emotional energy as you can, because that's what they're feeding off of. And if you know that what they're telling you is a lie, you don't get upset about it. You don't generate that negative emotional energy. So that's the single most freestanding program that we have that anybody can use to fight back against these voices. The other's the 23rd Psalm. They can't stand the Gregorian chants. The monks that are praying, they can't stand that. They don't like the smell of sage. But they are entities. They're not hallucinations. They're parasitic entities, and that's the last thing they want you to know. You go to tell a schizophrenic that the voices are sucking their energy, the voices are going to go nuts. I had to be very careful when I revealed that fact to a schizophrenic who was hearing voices, because they would go crazy. That's the last thing they want the person to know. If you had a leech on you sucking your blood, you wouldn't just sit there and go, oh, there's a leech on me sucking my blood. You'd want to get rid of it. Well, that's what these voices are. They're leeches, and they hit us all. Nobody is free from them. Every negative thought you have come into your head belongs to you, belongs to them.
I'm not sure if you can see the question. We'll take this for the last question, and I thank you very much, Jerry. Again, I'm just astonished. I've took quite a bit of notes here, so I'll be able to go over it, and hopefully in the future we can get you back on. But there's a question there. We'll make that the last one. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I don't think OCD and schizophrenia are the same thing at all. OCD is repetitive motions to kind of try to feel like you're in control of your life when it's out of control. The Mace energy method works great with OCD. It doesn't work as well with schizophrenia, but it will help a great deal. I mean, I've been using it with schizophrenics in my practice, but all these other ones, depression, neurosis, OCD. The Mace energy method works great with those kind of things, and there are Mace practitioners in all over. So
Excellent.
what big pharma wants you to think is you got to take some kind of drug.
Mhm.
They don't want this kind of information getting out. They don't want Mace practitioners proliferating, because they're making billions of dollars a year selling their drugs. They don't want you getting better. They want to sell drugs. They don't make money. If you get better, they don't make money.
Yep. What I find astonishing as well is there's no studies done whatsoever. It's like the work in connecting patterns between all the voices and the voices that studying or analyzing these voices. The only kind of studies is being done by yourself, and I find that astonishing. And I can't help but think, well, they clearly don't want people to know then, right? Otherwise, they
Nope.
would have done the analyzing voices and looking for patterns or looking for another answer. Surely, in Scotland, the health crisis is it's gigantic now in terms of the mental health, and a lot of these people they're possessed, if you like, and then they should probably go to a hospital, but they don't. They end up in prison
Right.
because
Same
they've
thing
not.
here.
Yeah, is it the same there?
Same thing here. The prison,
Hmm.
they closed down all the psychiatric hospitals. These people went out onto the street. They can't work. They can't concentrate. Their head is full of demons. They rob. They steal. They commit crimes. They get thrown into prison. So they're abused in prison, in a negative situation, and after they're done their thing, they're done their prison sentence. They go, okay, we throw you out on the street with $50, and they're in worse shape than when they came in. So the demonic entities are in charge of those prisons too. When I had patients recovering in the prison, I thought the medical staff there, the chief psychologist, would be thrilled that we found the cause and a cure for paranoid schizophrenia. Prisoners were recovering. No, they went nuts. I had an investigation on me saying, oh, I was experimenting with prisoners without the department's permission. They went after me. They wanted to fire me for this. They didn't want a cure, and neither does Big Pharma, and neither does the medical establishment. They don't want a cure. They're making a ton of money with their merry-go-round mental health system, where people are going in and out, in and out, in and out, constantly being fleeced of all their money. The health systems they're horrendously expensive. Nobody's getting any better with this Western mental health system that we have right now. This drug-fueled mental health system that cures nothing. Run by psychiatrists who have one of the highest suicide rates of any of the doctors on the planet. It's insane what's going on right now.
I find that very telling when you talk about the extent of suicides in that area. That is very telling when you think about it. And not only that, we've touched on it a wee bit before, doctors in the UK, I think it's the highest suicide rate out of any profession. These people are doctors. And I kind of think I thought they were there helping people or caring for people, which of course, when you care for someone in a genuine fashion or treat them in a proper way, it makes you feel good. You feel better. But these people clearly are not feeling good. So they're not caring for people. They might be caring for them, but in another way. That might be another story. But do you think entities would? I mean, you talked about their drugs. I can see different drugs being a gateway, maybe to an extent. What about cinema or movies and music? What would you say to that?
Well, the acid rock stuff, the demons thrive on that stuff, where they talk about killing and beating people up, and that nasty, harsh music. They love that stuff. On the other hand, the Gregorian chants, calming, peaceful music, they don't want any part of that. People who are schizophrenic shouldn't be watching violent television shows. The voices love violence. They love murder. They love war stories. They love all this negative stuff. And you look at what's playing on television, that's all negative stuff. It's all negative programming. And these entities feed off of that negative energy. They're feeding off of this war with what's going on in Ukraine right now. They're feeding off of everybody being scared as the nuclear weapons are being ramped up. It's like a hog's trough for them. We're like cows for them. They put us out. They can't generate their own emotional energy, just like we can't generate cow milk. So we put the cows out to pasture, they eat grass, they produce milk, and we milk them. These things do the same thing with us. We eat food, we go out and generate emotional energy, and they come and they milk us. And they milk us in 1,000 different ways.
A great way to put it. A great way. Fantastic. Is there anything you would like to add? I know we're a bit over time, so I do apologise, but thank you again, Jerry, and Sensum as well. Is there anything you want to add, Sensum?
Well, just note that any negative thought that comes into your mind doesn't belong to you. It's being inserted into your thought stream to generate an emotional response, which these things feed off of.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I often get the problem is a lot of people, and I'll finish on this statement. A lot of people confuse realism with negativity as well. So, for instance, if I'm in a discussion with, say, for instance, my boss, and he has an unrealistic demand on time. In other words, this will be done by, and everybody knows it can't practically be done by a specific time because there could be several external factors. When you point that out, they come back with, "Oh, you're just being negative." The reality is, no, I'm being a realist in that instance. So there's obviously there's a lot of people like to conflate realism with negativity. So in other words, faux negativity.
See, what these negative things you're going to do is they're going to be telling you, well, your boss is full of crap. That's impossible. You tell him off.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about he wants something to happen here 3 weeks before we actually take the delivery of the thing that we can make it. So there's there is a physical barrier there between
there is, and what
perception and realism.
Well, there is, and they're going to take the conflict and pour gasoline on it.
Oh yeah, exactly. So that, like I say, they accuse me of being the negative one. They are denying themselves that the facts are these, and then they, essentially they will then lash out at the people telling them realistically that it cannot be done. So they are the negative ones. Do you understand what I mean by that? But anyway,
I understand exactly what you're saying. There was one time when I was working in the prison where they wanted to reduce the amount of psychiatric drugs they were using. Okay. Now, psychiatric drugs have their place in mental hospitals and in the prisons. I mean, there's some of these people that are so out of control that if you don't drug them down, they're going to hurt somebody, and they're there. Believe me, they're there. So here's this one psychotic guy on the prison unit I was working. Since the psychiatrists know nothing about voices, they're monitoring his voices and they're kicking up. They're getting worse and worse and worse. So I send him over to the medical unit to get evaluated and medicated. So they put a stooge over there to turn these people back with a different diagnosis so they didn't have to spend money on medications. So they send him back with, they go, oh, he's not psychotic, he's a personality disorder. So I wrote this whole page saying, yeah, the voices are they're doing this, they're doing that. So I sent him back again. I said, no, the voices are ramping up, they're getting louder, they're telling him to kill somebody. They sent him back again saying, no, he's just a personality disorder. I sent him back a third time saying, this guy is getting very dangerous. You better do something about it. They sent him back again. I had filled the medical record with notes saying, this guy's very dangerous. A week later, he stabbed somebody 13 times. And I was so furious, I couldn't go to work for 2 days because I was afraid I would physically assault the chief psychologist for doing that. I mean, I was ready to strangle him. I couldn't go to work. I was too angry to go to work. So I know what you're saying. And that's exactly what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to go in there and punch that guy in the face.
Yeah, well, once again, thank you for the qualification. And when you look at the negativity in terms of not necessarily coming for you, I think that's quite an enlightening and also an empowering mindset to have, in my opinion. And I would just like to say thank you very much, Jerry, for giving us the time to come on this stream. Been absolutely fascinating, and every stream I've heard you on, I've really enjoyed listening to the things that you say, and I say that unironically. Yeah.
Well, I thank you guys because I couldn't get this out any other way. I've been banned from YouTube. I've been banned from Facebook. I think that YouTube recently let me back on. They don't want this getting out. It's going to have to come from the people and move upward because it's not going to come from psychiatry, psychology, or the universities and move downward. They've set in their system. They're making a lot of money doing what they're doing. They're not going to change that. They don't want a cure. They don't make any money from curing people. They make money from people being sick or psychotic or crazy. And you saw how much they're making. It's in the billions of dollars. They have no interest in helping people.
Yeah. Yep, I would certainly agree with that. I think Sensum would. So thanks very much, Jerry. That it's been great. Honestly, the work that you've done, amazing. But the experiences that you can share is second to none. And I think there's so much in that. You're like a vault of information. In the way you've went about your work, I've got so much respect for you, how you've carried it on in the field while at work and carried out your own experiments, if you like. And I find that fascinating. And I think that's how people should be. But clearly, in when it comes to most cases, they don't. They echo what they learn at university, and that's it. They just go with it. And yeah, that ends up being a high suicide rate, which is no surprise, I guess. But thanks again, Jerry, and make sure you check out Jerry's website. It is linked in the description, so you can check it out. And maybe at the beginning of next year, we can get you on again if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. And I have people who have been psychotic who are willing to come on and talk about it too. What it was like to be there, what it was like to be in the mental hospital, what those drugs actually did. I have one psychiatric nurse who could actually see these voices, who's willing to speak out about them. I have people who've been there and are willing to speak out also to back up what I'm saying.
Yeah, that would be great if you could. I think I have seen them, the interviews you've done before where you took them on, and they were fascinating. Honestly, I was blown away. I was like, holy moly. So yeah, that would be great if we towards the end of the year we'll maybe try and arrange it. Then maybe in January, February, we'll get you both on, and yeah, I'm sure people will be certainly up for hearing that. And thanks again, Jerry. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you have a good the rest of your day and a great weekend. And yeah, take care.
Okay, send me a link when you have one.
I will do. Thanks, Jerry. Cheers.
Okay, you're more than welcome.
Cool. So, and then there was two. Now, I know Sensam's got to go as well, but we'll just basically end it here. You're on at 8 o'clock, I believe, Sensam, are you?
Yeah, I was scurrilous and dropped the link in the chat, so it won't be
Cool.
as. It's an irreverent look at the week's news, and expletives are allowed. So
Cool.
but thanks for
Well,
having me on, mate. I've been
yeah.
speaking about Jerry for ages. In fact, since the first time I saw Jerry was on James Dellingpole's channel, and since then I've basically been following him ever since. And like I say, it's not as though it's just guesswork. I mean, it's all factual, recorded annotations of experience and knowledge and direct interactions with these people. And he comes up with these correlations, which the regime doesn't want to even hear about or understand. And yet, a lot of the evidence just points to, not necessarily be, well, put it this way, there's nothing physical or biological or chemical that they can identify which causes these people to hear these voices. So read from that what you will.
Yeah, fascinating. It blows my mind, honest to God. And after everything that I've seen, still, my mind gets blown. You think you know and you've seen it all, but clearly we've not, right? And I look forward. I did mention today when I was on about some of the people that Jerry knows, and hopefully, yeah, we can get them on as well. And I'm sure that'll be fascinating. People will certainly enjoy it, and it'll get it out there. That's for sure. And hopefully, hey, who knows? Maybe we can help people. Who knows? We might just
even if even if one person hears and they themselves may be affected, they may have a loved one who's affected. If it helps them in some small way, then it's job well done as far as I'm concerned. But Jerry is quite right. The regime and the machine, as I call it, the evil demons, as everybody knows I call them, they will fight tooth and nail not to let this information out. So anyway, mate, thanks once again for having me on the stream. I do appreciate it.
Cheers for coming on, Mr. Backbone of YouTube. I'll let you go and set up your stream, and I'll jump on and give you some abuse.
Okay, mate. I look forward to
look out for me.
Take care, everybody in the chat. God bless. See you soon, hopefully.
Cool. Cheers.
Take care, mate.
Thanks. Cheers. So what we'll do now is say cheerio. Thank you to everyone who joined. Justine, Frank, the information tank. Next time we'll try and take a wee bit more questions, but I can't multitask, so it's me, right? It's a duck, Spanish chicken, the beautiful Justine. There was lots of people that I missed, so I do apologise. Don Browning, sent some talking nonsense. Tree Dude, good to see you. Bry was in the hood, good to see Bry. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll shoot off, and yeah, I think I'll be the next time I see you probably Monday night, and we'll be getting into the whole 9/11 situation. September the 11th, 2001. Seemingly something happened then. We might look into it, right? So I might jump on before then on a kind of catch-up situation. If not, I'll be back again on the Monday. So yeah, like I always say, whatever you do, do not live in fear. Don't do it. Don't buy it, right? Just don't. Do what you've got to do. Don't let anybody get in your way, man. Don't let it happen. And like I always say, no matter what, no matter where, do not comply. And that is about it. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, what did we learn from this inquiry? First, I hope that all of you learned, if you hadn't known ever before, that all of you learned that you don't trust the political establishment in Scotland or in Britain. And that's lesson number one. That you don't trust the political establishment in Scotland or in Britain. And that's lesson number one. And that's lesson number one. And that's lesson number one.